Well, welcome. Let's just formally introduce you to the subject at hand, which is Africa's energy landscape, trends, opportunities, and innovative models for unlocking the opportunities in the landscape that we are addressing. A couple of stats before I introduce my panelists to put Africa in context for you. Recent stats indicate that out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 7 of those over the next 5 years are going to come from Africa. There are 1.1 billion people on the African continent. There's an abundance of natural resources, oil, gas, platinum, gold. The story is a bright one for Africa. But there are challenges, and we know that. So looking at those positive stats, you've got to compare them to the stats where we bring energy poverty on the continent to the fore. 7 out of 10 Africans do not have access to electricity. 90 million children go to school without access to electricity. 2% of South Sudanese and Burundians have access to electricity, and 3% of Liberians have access to electricity. So the challenge is enormous, but because of the challenge, there are fantastic opportunities for investor, and especially for foreign direct investment into the African continent, to close that gap and to get the energy environment into a thriving arena on the continent. I think at this point, let me introduce my panelists. To my right, we have Paul Hinks, who is the CEO of Symbion Power. To his right, Raj Shah, who is the administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. To my left, I have got the CEO and president of GE and Jay Island. And then, of course, to his left, I have got Kola Karim, who is the CEO of Shoreline Energy International, PLC. Obama, 2013, July. Power Africa, and suddenly the world is focusing on the African power stage. Raj, I'm going to ask you as the representative of the United States on this panel, where does Power Africa lie right now? We're 10 months down the line. We've got a very, very ambitious agenda to create. There are 6 countries that are involved in Power Africa, namely Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, help me out on this, Tanzania and Liberia, Ghana and Liberia, we've mentioned, and Nigeria. 10 million megawatts is the aim over 5 years, initially. Yeah. Where are we?
Well, we first, I just want to go back and say, President Obama was passionate in his launch of Power Africa last year in Africa because he believes, and after really a year and a half of listening to experts like our other panelists, but also Tony Elumelu and so many others that are here in this room, that the core constraint to growth and development, poverty reduction, educational expansion, improved healthcare, is access to energy. And you did a great job of laying that out. But it's hard to underestimate how critical improved energy access is to maintain the story of Africa as a continent rising. And that's why President Obama said, let's bring together the resources we have to focus on energy investment in Africa. The second thing about Power Africa is this really is intended to be a new model of development. A lot of the work we do is with governments to improve, frankly, government performance so that private sector partners can get responses to inquiries, paperwork back on time. We can improve technical management issues like helping the Kenyan grid deal with intermittent power and thereby allowing wind power projects to move forward, or allowing regional purchase agreements to take hold so that you can drive investor activity into certain types of power projects like the Korbeti power project in Ethiopia. The third thing I'd say is, with respect to what we've learned in the last 10 months, is that there's been far more interest and enthusiasm than we expected. You got panelists here that will talk about the specific projects, but Jay and Paul are outstanding leaders in that regard. But I do think we've all been surprised by whether it's very large-scale pension funds or very small-scale student entrepreneurs on the continent and around the world. They have stood up and reached out to us and say, we want to be a part of Power Africa. We understand this is a $50 to $100 billion investment requirement over the next decade. And we believe this is going to happen, and
Is
we
the
want to
money
know how to
coming? Is
participate.
the money coming to the fore? Let's just put that down on the line right
Sure.
away.
I mean, I think we could identify 9 or 10 core projects that have moved forward substantively because the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Export-Import Bank, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and our partners on this panel have all collaborated in a different and more focused and more transactional manner because of Power Africa. Now, that said, please note that American direct investment in terms of public dollars is not going to be the driver of creating energy access on the continent. We have to be enablers of a public-private model that brings certain norms and standards to the fore, and that's what our focus is.
Paul, let me bring you in here. Why is Power Africa going to create or manage to do what many other public-private partnerships haven't done? Is it because you've suddenly got the power of influence, you've got the leader of the free world, the biggest economy in the world, saying, I'm championing this cause? Is that why it's different?
As Raj put it, it's a new way of working. It's a new model. Power Africa is more about bringing all the tools that the US government has to bear, all the different agencies, the US Exim Bank, US OPIC, etc., but working in some cases publicly. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example, will give a grant, USAID will give a grant to the governments of these 6 countries, and that will allow them to do things which normally they wouldn't be able to. But above all, Power Africa is supporting the private sector, and it's stimulating interest from the private sector. And I'm seeing it all the time now, different companies saying, can I do that? And if I do that project, will it be supported by Power Africa? I can tell you that our company, Symbion, we've got several projects which we've frankly used Power Africa as a bit of a marketing tool behind us, and we've pushed very hard, and we've created projects where a good example is in Tanzania. We're going to build a 400 megawatt power plant and some transmission lines. And
I'm not going to let you do any more marketing right now, but we'll come back.
No, let me tell you why. Let me tell you why it's important. So the transmission lines, normally what you'd do is you'd buy your steel in India or Turkey, and you'd bring it. Now this time we're going to bring the steel from the United States, solely because US Exim Bank will support us because the steel's being manufactured in Houston in the United States. So we've actually crafted the project to make it everything that we can come from the United States so that we get the support of Power Africa and therein the US government agencies.
Along with GE turbines.
I see I'm going to have to keep you under control, gentlemen.
Sorry,
If I can add to that, I think the biggest thing about Power Africa for us specifically is I look at it as transactional advocacy for the U.S. government. So as we go into a project and we start running into roadblocks with governments where we have a hard time pushing through, we can call on Raj and his compatriots around and really take that advocacy we need around that transaction. So rather than a broad-based advocacy for Power Africa, we can get down into a little bit of the details. Hey, we're having a hard time pushing through a power purchase agreement. We need some help on a grid study, which we did in Kenya. Things like that, which before, without this, if you will, this group that has come together, we would have had a hard time. We would have had to do it ourselves. Then it becomes self-serving because we're trying to get this project done, et cetera, and this helps us from that perspective. So I think the transactional advocacy is really the right way to look at it.
Kola, let's bring you in here. There are those, the detractors to the Power Africa story, and I'm not going to spend that much more time on Power Africa, but there are those who say that the Americans are now fast-tracking their entry into the continent in retaliation to the Chinese that have been sewing up the resources on the continent. How are Nigerians viewing Power Africa? And perhaps also bring in Afrocapitalism at this point as well, because we like to say that Africans can solve Africa's problems.
Yeah, one of the important things you have to look at is this. Look at Africa with the number of people we have there, 1.1 billion people, and reverse that. You have a continent with the largest cocoa plantations, and yet how many chocolate factories do we have on the continent? You have a continent with huge natural resource base around iron ore, etc. Yet we import steel. We have a continent with the third or fourth in reserves of oil, yet we're importing petroleum products. We have a missing middle. And this, for me, I see Africa as an opportunistic position based around capitalist structure, creating value on a continent with 60% of very young, smart, intelligent, and educated people. The focus of seeing Africa, from my point of view, traveling around Africa, is creating and energizing those opportunities. So if you look at Power Africa itself, Power Africa is an amazing thing from the American point of view. It's marketing America in Africa. But the realistic position is, as Africans, whatever we see to evaluate is, do we take and seize this American opportunity?
So it's irrelevant whether it's been prompted by Chinese influence on the continent or
It
not.
doesn't matter. The realistic position is we have opportunities on the continent. We need the power to energize the growth on the continent. I'll give you a typical example. Look at Nigeria. We have an economy that's the largest in Africa today. We've got a huge potential of growth, numbers in population, yet the power being generated is 3,000 megawatts. It tells you if we could grow at 7% and above, if we're generating 20,000 megawatts, just look at what that transition sends into our economy. So it's an amazing potential, and the same right across Africa. So this is the strength of what Africa has to offer the world.
Just picking up on that point, I think the context is important that Nigeria recently rebased their GDP and are now some 60% bigger than South Africa, which traditionally has held the position as the largest economy on the continent.
But the difference there is South Africa's got 40 gigawatts of power to 3.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the other aspect, which was a great article in the Wall Street Journal last week, showed the comparative power for Nigeria with 180 million people or whatever. And the equivalent in the U.S. is the state of Montana. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that just shows you what the potential is.
No, but I'll tell you what, it's not only Nigeria. If you evaluate African economies today and look at the potential growth going forward, you will see the potential in this opportunity.
Kola agreed. But what most people in this room want to know is if they put their money into Africa, are they going to get a return on investment? Is that money safe? And Raj, I want you to give us an honest opinion.
President Kagame's here, and I think that's important because he's been very articulate on this point. And a big part of Power Africa is not just to say that those investments are secure, but to create a system that allows us to manage government performance risk, allows us to manage technical risk of projects getting done on time, and allows us to manage all of the other things that create the perception of very high risk to back up the case that when you make these investments, they can be highly profitable over time. You know, Jay's built a business very quickly in just a few years, doubling or tripling the size of GE Africa. I think if we succeed at doubling or tripling power access in Africa, you will see an explosion of value-added business development that will actually realize the potential of 900 million people emerging into a new middle class that will be a huge force for transformation. And frankly, that's why President Obama made Power Africa his core priority, not because we're competing with other countries, but because we recognize that Africa is hugely important to the future of the global economy, and America is much better off 20 years from now, 30 years from now, having deep and abiding, transparent and clear economic relationships that abide by the rule of law with a whole host of African countries that are thriving.
President Kagame, thank you very much for joining us. I think let's defer to you at this point, and perhaps you can take the floor. And I can jump off that question. Is money safe in Africa?
Money is very safe. It has been safe for some time. I'm sure in this room there are people who have already made investments in Africa and are continuing to do so and can speak to that in terms of the returns they are getting already. So more investments will give people more returns because it is also creating more opportunities and different potential areas that have not been fulfilled will be realized, and therefore everybody will be a winner, the investors and the African people. But let me add also to what Raj has just said. Power Africa is extremely important and better late than never, because African leaders, business leaders, political leaders and business leaders have been talking about energy issues, power, for a long time. We know the potential we have. It's huge. Just African Rift Valley alone provides 14,000 megawatts, and only 200 megawatts are available, have been exploited. Just imagine the difference. Africa holding 12% of hydro potential of the whole world, and yet Africa having 70% of our people not accessing electricity. So those challenges have opportunities in them. It's just an issue of investments. So that Power Africa is being talked about, and the United States government is taking that step to move forward, together with African Development Bank, the World Bank, can surely put together the amount of required capital to invest, which is estimated to be about 300 billion for the African needs. This can be done, and more other sectors would benefit from that investment to a scale that is unimaginable. So I don't see why we can't figure out how to do it and get moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. My job is to scour all the articles that have ever been written about each of you and go back to quotes that you have made in the past. So, Mr. Hinks, I know that you're trying to collect around about $80 million from one of the governments in that Power Africa initiative. You've been trying to collect that for 2 years now. You're confident that you're going to receive it, but you have been quoted as saying that a company like Symbion cannot sustain that level of non-payment or delayed payment.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, just to make this accurate though, this $80 million isn't $80 million that has been owed to us from 3 years ago and nothing has ever been paid. We get paid every week by that particular government. We receive checks all the time from them.
There was a recent quote.
Yeah, no, I'm saying it's to put it into what I want to do is put it into context. Is basically we've been getting paid, but we haven't been getting paid enough. And over 3 years, it has accumulated, and it goes up and down depending on how much money we get. But the reality is that if you're a company of our size, and our turnover is in the order of about $300 million per annum. So, compared to GE, we're tiny. So if you have a debt of $80 million, you don't need to be too mathematical to figure out what that's going to do to the liquidity of the company. And it has caused us enormous problems. However, we have this problem that should we decide that we're going to stop providing service, 2/3 of the country would be blacked out the next day. It'd be a catastrophe. The people in the government, I would say we like them a lot. They're our friends. I've worked personally with some of them for 30 years, and we trust them totally. It's cash flow management, but the problem is...
Is this something you're just going to have to live with if you want to transact in Africa?
We believe that problem will come to an end in the not too distant future. I've been believing that for about 2 years, but we think it's getting better.
At least you remain optimistic. GE has been on the continent 110 years, correct me if I'm wrong.
You don't have a quote from that far back, do you?
30, no.
Okay.
You operate in 35 countries. Can you add to the story? What do you see in terms of, and this is just about doing simple business. If you want to do business in a country, you want to be able to bill for your products and services, and you want to get paid for your products and services. You want to be paid timeously for your products and services so that you can pay those people that you may have borrowed money from for infrastructure investments, et cetera, et cetera. It's a cycle. And what is your experience?
Our experience, the experience that we've seen from our customers that have invested from the standpoint of the financial entities has been very profitable and really no real delinquencies or write-offs. And again, we talked about it before, but risk and the perception of risk, when those two there's a dichotomy with those two, that's when you make money. And right now, when you look at a lot of the projects around the energy sector, you have that span, if you will, that you can arbitrage. So I think there's a value there. However, you need to know what you're doing, where you're doing it, with whom you're doing it, because there's a lot of ways that people come in very naively thinking that they can do a power project and spend a lot of development capital that ends up, the real enemy here is speed. Okay, so it takes an average of 5 to 7 years to get a power project. It only takes 2 years, 18 months to build it. So all the other stuff is administration, et cetera. So if we can shrink that, and if you think about the deficit that Africa has today from an energy perspective, and as we sit here for an hour, how many more people were born? How many more people join the middle class? How many more people are going to need power? We're not even making that up when it takes 7 years to put a plant in the ground. So I think that's the key thing. So, and that is also from an investor perspective, how they think about it is that, okay, I've tied up development capital or even other capital in this 5 to 7 years where I get no return. And so that's one of the things that we need to do. So I think you've had a lot of, OPIC, Exim, et cetera, that have worked through this. But for a significant commercial play, we're going to need to shrink that. And that's where, we're looking at a lot of that to help.
That's the point of Power Africa,
Right.
is to get that 5 to 7 down to 2 to 3. And by our analysis on the 26 projects we initially targeted, that 5 to 7 was closer to 7 to 9. And so part of that is the transactional advocacy, helping our partners out when payments are slow, or part of it is dealing with technical issues, like helping to improve grid management in countries that are good partners, but where there are technical deficits in getting that done.
Is that realistic, getting it from 8 to 9 to 2 to 3? And what time frame are you putting to that?
It is. It maybe not 2 to 3 right away, but sheer focus and a really transactional approach is what differentiates kind of Power Africa from, in my view, a kind of traditional development policy program. And at the end of the day, some of it it's not all African government timelines either. I mean, getting OPIC, the Export-Import Bank, the World Bank, the IFC, and a few European development finance institutions to work in some degree of concert and to respect everybody's environmental assessments without requiring them all to be redone.
Underwriting
that
things
alone
in
improves
parallel
the process
rather than linear. I mean,
Exactly.
all those are add to it. I just want to make one comment to the money being owed. I can tell you, and many people have companies in the U.S. that, guess what? They've got delinquent accounts and they're owed money. And so it's not just an African problem. And I think, however, what happens is it gets highlighted that all of a sudden, I keep talking about pension funds. How many of them were in Detroit municipal bonds? Yeah. And where's risk?
Let's not deflect the attention. We're talking about Africa right now. I agree. There is context. I agree.
But that's my point.
I agree.
Is where the risk
It
is.
is not to be seen in isolation. I want to bring Kola in here. Sorry, Paul. 2011, you were quoted in an online magazine, Nobella. Somebody said to you, what do you fear about your business? What do you fear for your business? And you said, government. Government in Africa, because they control the key. Is that still the case? We're now in 2014.
As Africa's moving, we've seen the shift from 2011 to date has been extremely fast. The wave of privatization on the continent has been frontal. And as that passes through, we're seeing a lot of more openness around the structure. I'll give you an example. 2001, if you look at telecommunications on the continent, Africa's shown we could transcend technology. From 2001 to date, if you take a country like Nigeria, we had from 50,000 mobile phone lines to 100 million today. It tells you the power of what Africa could transform. That's just one strength. What you see today is there's a lot more openness and open market driven policies from governments on the continent, and that's driven more by the private sector. With that openness and the door policy the governments are opening right across the continent, it's encouraging businesses in being able to leverage balance sheet, debt, equity, capital markets in making those commitments and investments. And the more these governments continue to do that with the force of encouragement, then it creates an openness in building the business.
Kola, do you still fear the government? You need to answer my question on that point.
It depends. It depends. But I'll tell you, no.
We've got an economist in our midst. Is that your background?
I'd say this. Governments are now more open, and the force of democracy is keeping it more fluid on the continent. Do I fear them? Maybe not.
Yes, Paul, absolutely.
I just, one point, going back to this money issue. Despite this problem and 3 years of dealing with this problem, we are today investing in 3 new projects in that same country. So that tells you what we really think about the government and the people there. We see
the rewards outweigh the risks at the end of the day.
The rewards outweigh the risks, and the reality is that the very honest, decent people who we know we will be paid in the end. If we felt any different, it would be a whole different story.
President Kagame mentioned hydropower and the potential for hydropower to solve a lot of the problems when it comes to energy on the continent. I've watched an interview where somebody put Inga Dam to you, and you just said, Inga Dam, Inga.
Me?
You.
He said that?
33 years in the making.
I think that was you interviewing me.
No, it wasn't me interviewing you, but 33 years in the making. So when we talk about speed, there we've got a solution. We know that the hydropower in Inga, it's quoted, it says it can basically service half of the African continent. Those are the stats that are doing the rounds. So why don't we pull all the resources, make Inga Dam work, and suddenly you've got, half of the continent electrified?
Yeah, I mean, I could take you back to President Obama's speech, which he made in Tanzania July last year. And in that speech about Power Africa, exactly what he talked about was cutting red tape and having a sense of speed and urgency. You're right that Inga is an amazing project technically and has the resource to solve most of Africa's problems if you also connect it with transmission lines throughout all these different countries. But you have to, at the end of the day, come back to the fact that the DRC has been one of the most unstable countries in Africa for this entire period of time.
It's governance issues that are stored in the project.
If you're talking about private investment, investors aren't going to put their money into somewhere where government could be overthrown with a coup tomorrow, or there's insurrection or whatever. And there has been a lot of problems in the DRC. So I would imagine that the development of Inga has been affected. The pace of it has been affected. However, there is now a renewed initiative, and I think Raj is probably the best guy to talk about that. He knows a lot more about it.
But can I say
Yes.
this? There's been traveling around the world in a lot of conferences where we have savvy investors looking at the continent. I think we miss a point. The point is the interest of the continent is known, the buzzing population, entrepreneurship on the continent is known, but we've got this grand idea on all these grand projects. That's why the 7-10 years. What stops us investing in the 50, 60, 70 sub-100 megawatt projects? Those are the quick wins.
Are those the projects off the grid?
Yes, those are the quick wins. We need to get the investments together. Those are projects that could be online in 12 months. That's what you get into the system to energize economies. If we're looking at this 1,500 megawatts, you're talking 6-7 years. The burning population of Africa, the youths, are not waiting for that.
Jay, you want to come in here?
Well, yeah, I mean, we sell quite a bit of we call distributed power, aeroderivative engines, gas engines, et cetera, to captive players, which are industries that, they're going to build a plant, they want their own power. and probably 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts in 50 to 100 increments. And those can be additive. And you can do the same thing on the grid, off the grid. It doesn't really matter. But there's a point of doing both. You can have grand projects, but at the same point in time, you can't wait for that to happen. You still have to add, a little bit at a time, because every 50 megawatt add is going to be helpful. I mean, most of the countries, Kenya's got 1,500 megawatts where I live. And so if we add 50 per, 3 times in a year, that's 10% of the grid improvement. So I mean, versus trying to do some huge project, which is good, and so you need to balance both.
You need a simultaneous
Then you got to think about the
strategy.
transmission in the grid.
Yeah.
So that's another big
Raj,
thing.
let's come back to you in terms of small, medium businesses being helped to do exactly what we're talking about here. And I suppose it will be largely in the renewable energy space. I stand corrected, but...
Well, I agree that you need an all-of-the-above strategy, that we've done a 10-megawatt microhydro in Tanzania and got it up and running quickly, because that is where you get the quick wins. And when you have 600 million people essentially off-grid with no energy access, we're always going to want to transact on absolutely as many of those as one can fill in a pipeline. At the same time, we're here at the Milken Institute conference, right? There are how many trillions of dollars of capital represented in this conference? You're not going to drive billions of dollars of investment into off-grid microhydro solutions throughout the continent, and you need both. I mean, I live in a country we're in a country that is experiencing an energy renaissance, because we have a system that works on a regional basis. So if you ask me, I think Africa has to focus on some regional projects. You have to get countries working together in an efficient manner to move them forward. The World Bank, the African Development Bank, and private investors need to develop the financing models, and I think you have a lot of the partners you need at this meeting to get these things off the ground. And it's not okay to say, well, it didn't work 3 decades ago, so we're not going to try it now. You got to do all of these things.
So you're saying
and
put
we gotta
money
move
into
forward.
Inga, let's get it working.
I'm saying we should look at all of the big, medium, and small off-grid projects and move forward whatever can be technically feasible, environmentally sound, and provide energy at a low-cost basis. The other thing I'll say is when you look at some of these bigger hydro projects, you are at 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour of power production. And you're not all that far from markets where people are trucking in diesel and paying 48, 49 cents
Right.
per kilowatt hour and running big businesses off of that. So especially if you can secure the investment with purchase agreements that seem to make great economic sense, we should be able to crowd capital in to do the whole range of things for Africa.
I live in Kenya. 40 to 50% of Kenya's power is hydro, which is great. But we also have pretty long dry seasons. So every Thursday in the newspaper is 2 pages of listings of where the power is going to be out over the next week. So we always look at what in our neighborhood, what's going to be out. That listing gets bigger the longer it stays dry. So the issue is you need a portfolio of power. You can't all rely on one specific. You need a hydro, wind. You need a base load, whether it's gas or coal, and hydro. So there's this portfolio that it's a cost portfolio, as well as a type of fuel portfolio, because there may be times when things don't work out to that point. So I think that's one of the aspects. So it's really a combination of using the natural resources, which President Kagame is absolutely right, but at the same point in time, making sure that there's a balanced portfolio of energy so one can be turned on when the other one has an issue, and that's really not what's there yet.
Can we come to Mozambique? Got one of the largest natural gas deposits. Only 15% of Mozambique has access to electricity. Isn't that a short-term win? But now, of course, we've got to come in on carbon caps and issues around the utilization of gas as an energy source when we are being environmentally sound. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
First of all, I think that the biggest problem Africa has with energy and the cost of it is the reliance on liquid fuels, imported liquid fuels, diesel, running gas turbines on Jet A fuel, this sort of thing, heavy fuel oil. So the sooner that that each country can get to use its own natural resources, the better. I think Rwanda's a great example where they have some liquid fuel stations, but what they're trying to do is develop the methane gas resource on Lake Kivu and some of the geothermal resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that once they get to that stage where they are able to use natural resources, you'll see a whole different situation. One of the big problems, you talk about carbon caps and things like that. Okay, the carbon caps are there for good reasons, but you see situations whereby the carbon caps and the discouragement of investment in coal-fired power stations by, I would say, this side of the world, what that eventually does is drive them into bringing in diesel generators and then pumping smoke out of diesel generators
So it basically compounds the problem.
49 to 50 cents per kilowatt hour, which makes no sense whatsoever. So I think I always makes my stomach turn when I hear about people trying to block coal-fired power plants in African countries when the baseload of the United States and the United Kingdom and most of Europe was coal.
But
Yes, go ahead.
that is a very important point we need to look at in Africa. We need to think environmentally, positioning and being friendly. In Uganda, in Mutundwe, I remember this in 2006 when they had the big energy crisis, and we went in with the diesel sets, and we had pickets who stopped it because of the smoke. Now, we've got a national economy that's depending on energy for survival, any type, because it was a terrible situation, and yet the environmentalists won. So for me, I think there's got to be a straightforward line in what Africa needs, what Africa deserves, and the global norms in itself.
And perhaps just to elaborate on that, it's one thing to look to the future generation, but if you don't support the current generation, you're not going to have a future, are you?
100%.
So let's go back to the carbon cap issue, because this has been restricted for OPEC specifically. Do you think that legislation along the lines of the Electrify Africa Act can change the status quo?
I do. I think you've seen in Electrify Africa some flexibilities that would enable us to be more, to work more efficiently on an all-of-the-above strategy. That said, and this is particularly why I think it's important to understand the natural resource base and think about what's low cost and efficient. I mean, you have tremendous hydro resources that can be deployed at low cost in a significant manner, but it requires regional cooperation to unlock that potential. And this is part of why that's so important. I do think if you look at the large-scale transformation of power in Africa, there are going to be some choices made about what constitutes the base load, what is the appropriate mix, and we look forward to kind of an African plan that prioritizes hydro and gas and renewables in a responsible way.
I think if you look at Africa's needs over the next decade, you're talking about probably at least 100 gigawatts, if not more, based on the growth and everything that we see. So the question is, how are you going to fuel that 100 gigawatts? There's not enough of any one specific fuel that's going to do 100. You need, again, back to that portfolio. So if you think about putting that together, you have 300 to 400 TCF of gas off the coast of Africa, not just Mozambique, but everywhere. So to get that gas, as Paul said, into power is a key thing. The other one is renewables. There's absolute wind, solar. There's definitely a play for that. But the other thing, which we talk to people when they talk about that, is that the issues that you have putting in a wind farm and a solar farm, which take up a lot of land, is the same in Africa as it is in California. You got to worry land rights. You deal with, villages of moving them or having the space around it. Some of the people don't want that in their backyard. It's no different there than it is here. It's not just because all those resources are there. We're putting up 2 wind farms in Kenya right now, looking at more in Ethiopia, and it's the same. That development phase of what we see in a developed market is the same. So I think those are the kind of things that people need to understand. Is that is a difficult portion working in Africa, and it's got nothing to do because it's Africa. It's because it's people's homes. and what they want to, how they look at it.
Kola, talking about working in Africa, just one of the trends that we've seen in the Nigerian power environment of late, well, it's been going on for a couple of years, is the divestment of international companies, the likes of Chevron and Shell. I know that you picked up Shell's assets in 2012, and then the investment of Nigerian companies. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that trend?
I think the biggest thing that's happening to an economy like Nigeria is the institutions, financial institutions have come of age. 10 years ago, a Nigerian bank could not write you a check of $50 million. But today, a Nigerian bank could write you a $500 million check. So it tells you hugely from a local source. From that base, you could raise the capital to do this. The opportunities that's been thrown up in Africa, especially a place like Nigeria, where Shell, Total, Eni, the global oil companies, are finding it difficult to operate in a certain section of the country. And companies like ourselves, who now have that pass international smell test, you tick the boxes, and capital could follow you, both international and local, we could do the deals. And more importantly, oil and gas and natural resource has been shown that is not a preserve of a certain international clandestine movement. It's an open general thing to understand. You could buy it. You could buy services. So reality is today, fast forward, in 2.5 years, we've bought a field from Shell that was shut down for over 7 years. We picked it up, it was doing 30. Today we're on 60,000 barrels a day. And in another year, I should be doing 100,000 barrels a day. So the reality is the opportunities that Africa is throwing to us is the financial services and financial institutions on the continent are now open, are now in a position to raise in international capital to back themselves up, either by bond, equity, or otherwise, and lending that into working in African economies.
So you need depth and breadth of capital markets when it comes to the power industry specifically, and a lot of that involves partial guarantees. There's an innovative put-call option that has been made around the power purchase agreements in Nigeria that many of you have been quoted as saying, I think Jay, you were quoted as saying that this should be rolled out across the board. We need to see more of that, don't we? Because it's again the creditworthiness of the off-takers, the people, the governments generally, who buy electricity from those that are making the electricity that is hindering the process.
Keep coming to me whenever you talk about creditworthiness. I'll be assassinated next time I go to Africa.
You can always hospital pass to. Well, do you want to push it to Jay?
No. It's Tony, you help us.
Can we get a mic to Tony Elumelu, the chairman of AS Holdings?
So I speak as someone who has invested in Power in Africa and somebody who believes strongly in the Power Africa initiative, which I will say something about soon. But on the issue you raised, Paul and Jay are partners. Paul is a co-investor in the biggest power plant in Nigeria that we own. And the experience has been very interesting. Government has paid since we took over. We took over the first plant in November last year. And to date, the aging of our receivables is under 35 days. So I think that is very, very good, commendable. I want to say something briefly about Power Africa and about this lack of low access to electricity in Africa. Seminars, conferences we'll keep having. We'll talk about access to power, access to electricity. And when we have this kind of opportunity, $18 trillion available, we want to see people have capital. There's opportunity in Africa. Why is it not working? And that's why I see a lot of benefits from the Power Africa initiative. It's not just about mobilizing $7 billion or $100 billion. It's about the momentum that is unleashing. And so if President Obama meets with African leaders, for instance, later this year, and he says to African leaders, there's money, investment opportunities, and money for investment in power in Africa, but this is what investors are complaining about. You guys do something about it so that this money will get to Africa. I think that kind of call, to me, is even more important than $100 million coming out. We pledged $2.5 billion under the Power Africa Initiative. We would not have been able to invest the first tranche of $300 million if the enabling environment was not there. Now, discuss also, we are in talks, we've started with GE and Symbion to roll out additional 1,000 megawatts of electricity, which is, in today's term, a third of what Nigeria is consuming. In addition to 1,000 megawatts we have, we can do this because the environment is there. If the environment was not
it's
there,
not there across the African continent. Now,
that's what I'm saying. That's what about Power Africa. Therefore, if we can see Power Africa beyond just capital, see it also advocacy, getting people to do what is right, the government to make sure that we liberalize our processes and regulatory environment so that people can come in to invest, so that people don't owe Paul again, and also you don't spend 7 years to get a power project running.
Jay, you wanted to come in here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony.
I think the way to think about it is it's a balance sheet. And the balance sheet is the government's balance sheet. And it's typically wrapped around what the IMF levels of debt, et cetera, is. So if you have a government that subsidizes fuel, that gives sovereign guarantees, subsidizes the price of gas, whatever, you have where they're chewing up their balance sheet. So the key is to have an economic value chain from fuel to consumer that basically there's a return across all that so people can invest. And I think that's part of the whole Power Africa thing in many countries is working with governments to make sure they understand that. Because a fuel subsidy, or whether it's, a power subsidy, you go into some countries, South Africa is a very cheap power because it's been subsidized. And yet,
and that's a deterrent to private investors anyway.
Exactly. So what happens, because
there.
you can't get, it's hard to make a return on that. So so you need to let the normal economic value chain flow through. And I think that's one of the things that we're starting to see. But there has to be that capability because it's a fixed amount of capital that a government can deploy. So people come in, a lot of financial players come in and say, I want a sovereign guarantee. A lot of the countries can't afford to give the sovereign guarantee. So those are the things.
So it comes back to the dip.
So credit enhancement
as well.
Credit enhancement's a big deal.
Yeah, I think credit enhancement is a big area where we can also make real progress with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and others kind of reprioritizing this. And I think if you look, you've seen just in the last year much more focus and resources deployed towards that purpose. The other thing I'd just say, based on Tony's comment, it is easy, and you can do this. You can point to projects that take too long or where you're not fully paid or things that don't look like they're working. The difference here is in a short amount of time, you're now able to point to successes. Yeah. And I think the Nigerian privatization is a successful story. It has got lots of challenges, and no one articulates it better than others on this panel.
But it's moving in the right direction.
But it's moving in the right direction, and it's creating a model that other countries can basically follow and implement if they want to crowd in, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of private investment in generations. So I think that's what's different now than maybe 18 months ago, and that's important to note that has happened in a relatively tight time frame.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Jay, go, and then I know Paul wants to go to Nkola.
The other potential really here is to do the leapfrog, which you hear a lot about. Okay, why not, when you get to the disco companies, et cetera, the transmission companies, have, the consumers have prepaid electricity. There's a lot of smart grid stuff that's out there today that wasn't there when they built the grids, that we don't want to build the grids that are already 10 years old in technology. So using this new money, Power Africa and all, we should be focused on smart grids, smart distribution, where all of a sudden you're able to use mobile money. There's a lot of potential out there, but we're not thinking of it that way yet. And I think that helps the whole collection problem.
I've just got to jump in really quickly to say we've used things like SMS-based billing to dramatically improve collections for the Afghan energy utility. And now you're seeing an environment in Africa where all of these best practices can be deployed to dramatically improve the creditworthiness of these projects. And since I said creditworthiness, the next speaker should be Paul.
Sorry, Paul,
So,
I've really
okay.
done it for you now.
So I think I would be remiss to sit here and we're all talking about the Nigerian story and the privatization, and Tony's chairman of our Nigeria investment there and our lead partner. We went into that experience. When we started off, so many people told me, you're crazy. It's Nigeria. You're not going to get past the first base without some guy showing up wanting bribes and this and that, the corruption, etc. So I went into it and I sort of said to myself, and I said to my key management, as soon as that happens, we're out. And we went on and we went on and we went on. We met Tony. He guided us through the navigated the Nigeria system. And I promise you, to this day, no Nigerian official, no Nigerian businessman has come into us, asked us for bribes to pay off officials or anything like that. So it's been the exact opposite experience. And do I feel secure at night when I go to bed and knowing that on the ground that we've got a great partner in Hayes Holdings and Transcorp? Do we feel that our money is safe? Yes, we do. And I think that's what a lot of the people here at the Milken Institute are interested in, is where can I actually go and invest, get a good rate of return, and feel safe and secure, and where can I find the right partners?
We did set that out, Paul. We set that out at the top, saying that's exactly
Yeah.
what we're trying to achieve for this audience. I think we do need to, though, as we have, touch on some of the realities on the ground. Kola, I'm going to bring you in here. I mean, I do want to just point out that I'm an Afro-optimist. I spend my life broadcasting the African story around the world. I get very frustrated when intra-regional trade, which is a short-term opportunity, 1 billion people on the African continent, if they start trading with one another, that kickstarts a whole economy in itself. I get very frustrated when we speak about that year after year after year on these forums. So what I'm saying is that, great, but let's see these transactions, let's see the governments. Not all governments are like Rwanda and President Kagame, who is one of the most competitive economies on the African continent. We're not seeing the majority of African leaders mobilizing resources to the extent that we've seen in Rwanda. Kola?
Look, one important area you need to think about, if Africans could trade with one another, with the numbers we have, there's prosperity tied in onto the continent.
And they say they're going to be 2 billion people by 2050.
We're busy people in Africa.
Exactly.
Very busy. But one great area is, just think about this. If as an African I could move freely on my continent without restrictions, just imagine how much brain power, how much financial capacity I could deploy. If as a Nigerian business I'm trying to go to Gabon, as an example, I need a visa. But if you look at the benefits that's worked out from countries like Rwanda, Kenya, that's opened its doors, Uganda, Nigerians, now you don't need a visa. Just think about the traffic of trade.
We are
that's going
speaking
on.
the same language, Kola. That's
So-
all I want to see, is that the visa issues between these countries on the African continent, surely it can be sorted.
That's one issue. The other big one is logistics. You can't to take something from you can't get something from Kenya to Nigeria without putting it on a ship and running it around
To Dubai or to Europe.
And so that also has to be, and that's hard work, infrastructure, and whether it's rail, aviation, cargo, all that's starting to improve.
But one thing, the opportunity that Africa has today, you cannot benchmark it. You have a teeming, strong, virile population of young, smart, intelligent, educated people that are looking forward to something simple, a very good life. And that's the prosperity we want to share. Africa's time is now. Africa's opportunity is now. It's just for you all to come and take it.
Now, I'm going to hand back to President Kagame at this stage, but while I do that, I want my panel to think about their closing remarks. I want you to think about those projects that you think would offer the best ROI for the money in this room on the African continent, the hotspots. Obviously, we are going to be talking about the power environment, because that is where you gentlemen play mostly. So that's your task, while I hand over to President Kagame.
Thank you. There was a question a few minutes ago asking whether the panelists still fear the government. it's not without good reasons to ask the question, or even for the panelists to have thought there was reason to fear government. But at the same time, if we want to address most of these issues we are talking about, we have to invite government to be more and more business friendly. Because there are certain things that will not work properly unless governments really have buy-in or feel that it is their responsibility to try and get rid of some of these bottlenecks. For example, if we are talking about freedom of movement of people across the continent, we can't blame it on the private sector. We end up blaming it on governments. So governments have got, even when I was talking about the 70% of our people who are not connected, governments cannot sit back and just expect that the private sector will connect these 70% of our population unless they do what they have to do also to make sure that they work with the private sector and have the activities unlocking that potential and therefore benefiting our people. So there has to be partnership. This has to be encouraged. This has to be sought between private sector and governments. Well, we were also talking about a while ago Power Africa and how when the leaders of Africa come to Washington, if that's the place where we will be, you see, these are governments sitting and taking certain decisions, even with the invitation of President Obama of the United States. But it should be, alongside that, there should be private sector coming along and forging that strong partnership. Another thing where, for example, we are talking about regional projects that are very useful. For example, even in energy sector. I'll give you an example. We are developing a power project, and again, along those levels, a medium project of about 80 megawatts at Rusumo, which benefits Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. This is likely to be finished in a shorter time than waiting for a 5,000 megawatt project. But for it to work, the governments, the three governments, have to work very closely with the private sector. The governments alone can't deliver that, or the private sector cannot deliver that unless the people of the three countries are linked together. So there is no doubt that the governments, the private sector have to come together and do what needs to be done. This is the only point I wanted to add to.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. Thank you. Gentlemen, the task at hand, the hottest investment opportunities where your money is safe and you're going to get good return on investment, where the rewards far outweigh the risks. Mr. Kola Karim, can we start with you, sir?
My simple analogy I'm going to leave you with is Africa is like a dirty pair of shoes. If you clean it, the beauty shows. Let's join hands and clean the shoes of Africa. Thank you.
Were you a preacher?
I'm a salesman.
That's true. That's true. Are we going this way?
We're going,
Okay.
Mr. Island. You are up next, sir.
For the potential investors in the room, I think the key thing is what you see up here is, number one, people and companies that put the money where their mouth is. We've invested in Africa. We're in the process of investing up to $800 million over the next few years, building manufacturing and assembly facilities across the continent, and also investing upwards of $100 million in project development equity to get a lot of these projects going. We've doubled employment in the last 3 years. We'll double it again in the next three. In the next three, and we think that this is the land of opportunity. You have to be in Africa now to basically get the benefits of the next decades of growth, and it's going to be harder. I was talking to an investor earlier about Asia, and he said, I feel like we're in the retail side. We're paying full dollar because everybody's been in there, and there's no real early mover advantage. So I would say, as Kola said it early, get in now, because the opportunity's there, and you got to do it, but you got to be with partners, and you got to have people on the ground.
Yeah, I would mirror what Jay's saying. What I would say is that there are 54 countries in Africa, as we always say. There are probably only a third of those that today we would go and invest in. It's not all countries across Africa where we feel comfortable. Things are changing, and each one is at a different place on the growth curve and the stability curve and all these other issues that they need to address. We think if you target countries and you target good projects, that you can make more money and more return on investment in those places, on those projects, than you probably can anywhere else in the world at the moment.
Raj?
I'd say this transactional advocacy that I think Jay mentioned earlier is the key to projects at all levels of scale. And the time of going to conferences and talking in broad policy terms is kind of over, and the game now is about have your project list, know who your advocates are, understand the risks that need to be managed, and just drive it forward with the right partners to manage those risks. If you have that mindset, then I'd say the small off-grid stuff is a kind of no-brainer return on investment. People spend a ton of money out of pocket. The poorest people spend the most to get any kind of access to light, to energy, to opportunity. And you are already seeing a huge explosion of business models that serve those populations. I think the mid-sized projects that has been so much the focus of Power Africa in this first 10-month period is also a no-brainer. Most of these can work on almost entirely commercial terms, so long as there's a transactional advocacy partner that's willing to solve problems with you in an effective way. But I'll also say that without the large regional projects, you simply don't get to the 100 gigawatts that you need. It just doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen at a cost structure that's required. And so our challenge now is to find the right transactional advocacy model, the right financing model, the right cooperative model. And as President Kagame says, when you show you can do it with Rusumo, which is a soon-to-be success story, that becomes an operational model for getting regional projects done that will ultimately unlock a huge amount of low-cost power and unlock the economic potential of a continent.
Gentlemen, thanks very much. Just a couple of closing comments from my side. It really hit home when I was flying into Los Angeles. I think it was last night. I'm very confused from a time perspective. And I just saw this amazing spread of lights as far as I could see, this bright, bright city. It was absolutely amazing. I spent a lot of time flying across the continent, as do the gentlemen on this panel, and I'm sure a number of you in the audience. And you do not see anything like that when you go into, or you're flying into Lagos, you're flying into Accra, into Kigali, into Nairobi. You have these small splatterings of light. And when I was flying in to host this conference, I thought, that sums it up for me. That's the difference. That's electrification. That's what a developed world is versus an emerging market. And I want to leave you with one more thought, because they say that there are 1.3 billion people worldwide that don't have access to electricity. To bring that number to zero requires an investment of $48 billion every single year until 2030. That is only 3% of the annual private sector investment in power. Only 3%, and you solve Africa's problems. Imagine what that is going to do for the African continent. Imagine then the opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.